It was an ordinary morning for Sarah Collins, or at least it seemed so. The clock read 8:15 when she left her downtown Washington, D.C. apartment, balancing a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder of documents in the other. As a federal prosecutor, her routine was intense, marked by high-risk hearings, tense negotiations, and investigations that shaped the future of justice in the country. But that Tuesday, her commitment was unexpectedly trivial, contesting a parking ticket. Something mundane for any citizen. But for her, it seemed almost comical in light of the cases she usually handled. However, Sarah was not the type to ignore an injustice, even if it was an ostensibly insignificant matter. She arrived at the municipal courthouse with the calm of someone who knew the system like the back of her hand. The building was old, with narrow corridors and a scent of aged paper mixed with the cheap coffee from the machines in the lobby. At the service counter, a bored clerk barely looked up to ask her name. She handed over the documentation and was directed to the courtroom where Judge William Barrett presided over that day's sessions. She sat at the back and observed the flow of cases. Gradually, a sense of unease began to form. White defendants received reduced fines, mild warnings, and even condescending smiles. Meanwhile, black defendants were treated with coldness, publicly reprimanded, and handed heavy penalties for minor infractions. Sarah didn't need much time to perceive the pattern. Something there was deeply wrong. Sarah crossed her arms and leaned slightly forward, focusing her attention on the judge's behavior. The difference in treatment was glaring. When a young white man entered to contest a traffic violation, Barrett smiled in an almost paternal manner and reduced the penalty to a verbal warning. But just a few minutes later, a black man, with impeccable posture and dressed in a well-tailored suit, was treated in a completely opposite way. The judge didn't even look him in the eye while reading the decision, dismissing any possibility of appeal and mandating the full payment of the fine with no right to contest. Barrett's voice was harsh, authoritarian, as if he were reprimanding someone who dared challenge him. Sarah felt her stomach churn. It wasn't a subjective impression, that was systematic, methodical, almost choreographed. With years of experience analyzing legal patterns, she recognized abuse when she saw it. And at that moment, she realized that she wasn't there just to contest a ticket. She was about to confront something much larger. When her name was called, Sarah stood with determined steps, striding down the corridor as if she knew exactly where she was going. She stopped in front of the judge and clearly announced her name: Sarah Collins, Federal Prosecutor. The murmur in the room was almost imperceptible, but the change in atmosphere was instant. Judge Barrett lifted his eyes from his papers and frowned, as if something about her introduction caused him discomfort. "And what does the federal prosecutor have to do with a simple parking ticket?" he asked, his voice laden with disdain. Sarah maintained her unshakable posture, but noticed the hostile tone in his question. She took a deep breath and responded firmly. "I'm here as a citizen, exercising my right to contest an unjust penalty." The judge leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "You're late," he said curtly. Sarah frowned. She looked at her watch. She had been there for at least 20 minutes before being called, sitting and observing every previous trial. No other white defendant who arrived after her was accused of being late. "Late?" she repeated, unable to hide her incredulity. Barrett nodded with an air of impatience and picked up his pen. "A $500 fine for failing to meet the deadline." The impact of the sentence hit like a punch. Sarah did not allow herself the luxury of an impulsive reaction, but her mind was already processing everything. This wasn't about tardiness. It wasn't about punctuality. It was a message, an attempt to silence her before she could even speak. Sarah maintained her composure, but inside her blood was boiling. She had faced arrogant judges before, but never in such a blatant way. This was not just hostility. It was an evident abuse of power. And the worst part, The entire courtroom seemed numb to it. No one blinked, no one questioned. It was as if this type of treatment were normal, accepted without resistance. Sarah scanned the room and noticed something even more concerning. The black defendants kept their heads down, shoulders hunched. There was no surprise on their faces, only resignation. They knew that nothing they said would make a difference. Judge Barrett had already decided each one's fate before they even opened their mouths, but Sarah was not someone who bowed down easily. She took the ticket receipt without averting her gaze from the judge and said, in a controlled tone but laden with meaning, "I will contest this decision." Barrett let out a short, ironic laugh, as if the idea were ridiculous. "Good luck," he said, already calling the next case. To him, Sarah was just another voice that would eventually be swallowed up by the system. But he was wrong. Upon leaving the courtroom, Sarah felt the weight of injustice pressing against her chest. She had always known that the judicial system had flaws, but seeing it operate so openly, without even disguising its partiality, ignited something within her. Her first impulse was to act immediately, but years of experience had taught her that important battles require strategy. So instead of confronting directly, she decided to gather evidence. She spent the rest of the morning inside the courthouse, observing and taking notes. With each case heard, she recorded the patterns. White men walked out with light penalties, while black men received the harshest punishments. Black women, then, were treated with a disdain bordering on public humiliation. When she realized she had witnessed enough, Sarah grabbed her cell phone and began drafting a formal petition. But it was not merely an appeal to contest her ticket. It was a detailed dossier exposing Judge Barrett's discriminatory conduct. The first step would be to contest the abuse committed against her. The second, to dismantle a system that allowed such actions to continue unchecked. Sarah knew that challenging a judge wouldn't be simple, much less swift, but she was in no hurry. She had evidence, and in the legal world, evidence was everything. Sitting in a cafe across the street from the courthouse, she opened her laptop and began cross-referencing information. Through the public database, she accessed Barrett's decision records from the past 6 months. The pattern was irrefutable. Black defendants received harsher sentences compared to white defendants with identical infractions. Racism was not only in the judge's demeanor, but also in the numbers. Sarah noted every discrepancy, highlighting the most extreme cases. To reinforce her argument, she consulted a colleague at the Department of Justice who worked with criminal statistics. Within minutes, she received a report confirming what she already knew. The racial disparity in Barrett's judicial decisions was a documented reality. Sarah took a deep breath. This was no longer just a personal matter. This was big. After organizing all the evidence, she began drafting the formal petition. But before finalizing it, she decided to return to the courthouse to collect something even more powerful: testimonies. If other people had experienced the same situation, their voices would be the key to transforming the case from a mere abuse of authority into a scandal of institutional discrimination. In the courthouse lobby, she approached a man who, hours earlier, had left the courtroom visibly frustrated. He hesitated as he saw her approach, but Sarah quickly introduced herself and explained her intention. "I saw what happened in there. I know it wasn't fair. I want to take this further," she said. The man, whose name was Marcus, exchanged a skeptical glance with her before sighing. "You think anyone will care? This happens here all the time. We just pay up and move on because we know fighting it is a waste of time." Sarah felt a tightening in her chest. Marcus was not just a victim of that judge. He was the portrait of a system that taught black people not to expect justice. But that was exactly why she had to continue. "This time, someone will care," she assured him, "and this judge will have to answer for it." Marcus studied Sarah for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she was just another well-intentioned person who would give up when things got tough. But something in her conviction made him reconsider. He looked around, making sure no one was paying attention, and then nodded. "All right, I'll talk," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "But I'm not the only one. Many people have been through the same thing, but no one listens." That was the confirmation Sarah needed. She pulled out her cell phone and began to take notes. Marcus recounted how, months earlier, he had received a traffic ticket that should have been forgiven with a warning, as had happened with a white colleague in the same situation. He had even tried to appeal, but Barrett simply denied the request without even reviewing the documents. "He didn't even look at me. He just said the decision was final and that I had to pay." Sarah already knew that, but hearing it from someone who had lived the experience was different. More than numbers and statistics, these were real stories. As they talked, others began to approach. First, a woman who had overheard the conversation and decided to share her experience. Then, an elderly gentleman who had been frequenting the courthouse for decades and knew very well how things worked in there. Each account reinforced Sarah's thesis. Barrett was not just a harsh judge. He had a pattern of discriminatory conduct that had been repeated for years. More concerning still was the realization of how people had already resigned themselves to it. "We just want to go on with our lives," said the woman, crossing her arms. "We don't have the time or money to fight a judge." Sarah understood. The system had been built so that the victims did not have the strength to challenge it, but she had the resources and the knowledge that most did not possess. And now she had witnesses. Looking at each one of them, she assured, "You won't have to fight alone. I will see this through to the end." For the first time, Marcus seemed to believe that something could really change. Sarah spent the afternoon organizing every statement and consolidating the evidence she had collected. The next step was to ensure that her complaint would have a real impact. She knew that a simple judicial appeal would not be enough to bring Barrett down. It was necessary to attract public attention. And for that, involving the media was essential. She grabbed the phone and called a trusted journalist, Eric Lawson, who had previously worked on exposés about corruption in the judiciary. "Eric, I have something big, but I need this to be handled seriously," she said directly. On the other end of the line, the journalist fell silent for a moment before replying, "If you're calling me, it's because you have evidence." Sarah smiled. He knew her well. "I have more than that. I have statistics, testimonies, and a judge who thinks he's above the law." The following pause was even longer. "Meet me at my office in an hour." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse even before the doors opened. She had spent the night reviewing every line of the petition, ensuring that there were no loopholes that Barrett or any other judge could use to disqualify the case. As soon as the clerk's office opened, she was the first to enter. The clerk, a middle-aged man with deep bags under his eyes, took the documents without showing any interest until he read the name at the top of the petition. His eyes widened. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked, lowering his voice. Sarah maintained her firm posture. "Absolutely." The man hesitated for a second before stamping the protocol and returning the copy to her. "Good luck," he murmured, before returning to his routine as if nothing had happened. Sarah knew that at that moment the gears were starting to turn. In a few hours, the petition would reach the competent authorities, and, with Eric's article about to be published, it wouldn't be long before the story exploded. And that's exactly what happened. In the middle of the afternoon, her cell phone began vibrating non-stop. First, messages from colleagues at the Department of Justice. Then, calls from unknown numbers. And finally, the headline appeared on her phone screen. "Federal Prosecutor accuses Judge of systematic racial discrimination." The report was direct, forceful, and packed with indisputable data. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline course through her body. There was no going back now. Either she brought Barrett down or he would take her down first. The impact of the article was immediate. Within hours, Barrett's name dominated social media, and civil rights organizations began pressuring the courthouse to provide an answer. But Sarah knew that the most important reaction was yet to come. His. And, as expected, it didn't take long. Early in the evening, she received a formal email from the courthouse requesting her presence for a procedural review the next day. The bureaucratic language attempted to disguise the obvious. Barrett was reacting. He wasn't just going to accept being exposed without a fight. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew she was prepared, but this was still a dangerous game. However, there was one crucial difference between her and the judge. Barrett was accustomed to operating in the shadows. Sarah, on the other hand, was used to fighting under the spotlight. The next day, upon entering the courthouse, she realized it was no longer an ordinary day. Journalists were at the door, microphones pointed at anyone remotely involved in the case. Courthouse staff whispered in the corridors, and an atmosphere of tension hung in the air. Sarah walked to the courtroom where the review would take place. When she entered, she found Barrett already seated, his expression more rigid than ever. He showed no surprise at seeing her, but there was something in his posture that betrayed discomfort. Next to him sat a defense attorney, a clear sign that he knew he was in trouble. The session began, and for the first time, Barrett did not have absolute control of the situation. The hearing began with the customary formalities, but the tone was different from the usual. Barrett was no longer the untouchable magistrate, handing out sentences without question. Now he was on the other side, being examined and confronted. The presiding judge, a veteran with a severe gaze, opened the session by reading Sarah's formal complaint. "We are here to review allegations of bias and inappropriate conduct on the part of Judge William Barrett, based on statistical patterns and testimonies from affected citizens." Silence fell over the room. Barrett adjusted his tie, maintaining an impassive face, but Sarah noticed the tension in his hands, clasped on the table. She had seen this kind of behavior before. The moment someone realizes that their power is not as absolute as they imagined. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah stood up and presented her evidence with the precision of an experienced prosecutor. She showed the patterns in the judicial records, the glaring discrepancies in the penalties imposed, and the testimonies of the victims. "This is not a matter of subjective perception," she concluded, looking directly at Barrett. "These are concrete data indicating a pattern of systematic discrimination." The judge maintained his rigid posture, but his eyes blinked rapidly, an involuntary sign of nervousness. His lawyer tried to deflect the focus, arguing that the cases analyzed could be mere coincidences, that each decision was based on legal criteria and not racial bias. But no one in the room seemed convinced. Sarah knew that at that moment, Barrett was beginning to understand that this was not a storm that would pass by unnoticed. The presiding judge analyzed the documents for a long minute before speaking. "In light of the evidence presented, I see sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation into Judge Barrett's conduct." The weight of those words fell like a stone in the courtroom. Barrett, who until then had maintained a neutral expression, clenched his jaw. Sarah sensed the tension in the atmosphere. Judges were rarely investigated. When it happened, it meant there was a real problem, something that could no longer be swept under the rug. And Barrett knew it. His lawyer attempted to intervene, requesting that the review be conducted privately, without public exposure, but the request was denied. "The public interest in this case justifies complete transparency," stated the presiding judge, cutting off any attempt at negotiation. After leaving the hearing, Sarah found herself in a corridor crowded with journalists. Microphones and cameras were immediately pointed at her. "Prosecutor Collins, what do you expect from this investigation?" asked one reporter. Sarah took a deep breath and replied firmly, "I expect justice. Nothing more, nothing less." As she walked away, she heard whispers among the courthouse staff. Some commented that they had never seen a judge being challenged in such a manner. Others seemed anxious, perhaps fearing what this investigation might reveal about the system as a whole. But Sarah did not care about the murmurs. She knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Taking down Barrett was not just about proving his guilt. It was about changing a system that for years allowed people like him to act without consequences. And she wasn't going to stop until that change happened. The investigation against Barrett unfolded quickly. With public pressure growing, new testimonies began to emerge. People who had previously been afraid to speak now saw a real opportunity for justice. Civil rights organizations started supporting the cause, demanding a broader analysis of the judge's decisions. Within days, the courthouse received more than 30 formal complaints from citizens alleging they had been victims of unjust sentences under Barrett's supervision. The numbers left no doubt. The discriminatory pattern was extensive and systematic. For Sarah, this was more than a personal victory. It was a warning that the system needed to change. But Barrett was not going to fall without a fight. He appeared in the media trying to defend himself, claiming that his decisions were based solely on the law and that the accusations were unfounded. In one interview, he even insinuated that he was the target of a witch hunt. "It's easy to take statistics and distort them to create a narrative," he said, in the calculated tone of someone who still believed he was in control of the situation. Sarah, however, knew that the facts were on her side. Each day, more evidence surfaced, and the legal community began to take a stand. Respected judges called for his resignation. Prosecutors denounced the devastating impact of his unjust decisions, and public opinion was clear. Barrett was cornered. The pressure became unsustainable. Barrett began missing courtroom sessions, citing health issues, a common strategy for judges trying to avoid direct confrontations. But the public did not buy that excuse. Protests began to take place in front of the municipal courthouse, with placards demanding his immediate departure. Barrett's name was on every newspaper, in every headline. And deep down, Sarah knew that he had already lost. The only question was when he would accept it. Then on a rainy morning came the news everyone had been waiting for. William Barrett resigned from his position. The announcement was made through a brief statement with no admission of guilt, but what truly mattered was the result. A judge who for years had used his power unjustly was finally out of the courtroom. Despite the resignation, Sarah knew her work was far from over. Barrett's case was just the tip of the iceberg. The real battle was to ensure that no one else in the judicial system would behave the same way without consequences. That's when the proposal emerged. An independent oversight committee responsible for monitoring judicial sentences and identifying discriminatory patterns before they became systemic. The idea, which began as a simple conversation between Sarah and some colleagues, quickly gained support within the Department of Justice. In a few months, the proposal became a reality. Now every municipal judge would undergo regular audits to ensure that their decisions were truly impartial. For the first time, the system was beginning to be monitored from the inside out. With the creation of the Oversight Committee, Sarah felt that for the first time, a concrete change was happening. But the impact of her complaint went beyond the bureaucratic structure of the system. Ordinary people began to understand that they had the right and the power to contest injustices. Social media was flooded with accounts from citizens who had experienced similar situations in other courthouses across the country. What was once treated as an isolated problem was now recognized as a symptom of something much larger. Sarah knew she couldn't solve everything at once, but she had taken the first step, and sometimes the first step was the most important. As the dust began to settle, she received an unexpected email. The sender? William Barrett. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity prevailed. The email was short and to the point. "Can we talk?" Sarah frowned. What could he want now? For a moment she considered refusing. Barrett did not deserve explanations nor compassion. but something inside her told her that hearing what he had to say might be important. The next day, she met him in a discreet cafe away from cameras and the spotlight. Barrett seemed different, less haughty, more human. "I spent weeks reviewing my decisions," he began, without preamble, "and I realized that perhaps you were right." Sarah remained silent, watching Barrett intently. It was hard to believe that the man who had spent years handing out discriminatory sentences was now sitting before her, admitting, albeit hesitantly, his mistakes. "I never considered myself racist," he continued, fiddling absent-mindedly with his coffee cup. "But when I was forced to look at the numbers, at the decisions I made, it became impossible to deny." He let out a heavy sigh, as if he were carrying a burden he was only now acknowledging. Sarah crossed her arms. "So, why did you do it?" Barrett hesitated. "I don't know. I think I was conditioned to see certain defendants one way and others another. The system always worked that way, and I never stopped to question whether I was just following a pattern or being fair." Sarah raised an eyebrow. This was the first time she had heard a judge so openly admit to an unconscious bias. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she felt that the moment was important. "And now? What do you intend to do with this newfound awareness?" she asked, challenging him. Barrett looked at her, and for the first time, he seemed truly reflective. "I want to help fix it. I know I can't change the past, but perhaps I can do something to prevent other judges from making the same mistakes." Sarah wasn't sure if she believed him, but she knew that if Barrett truly became an ally to the cause, it would carry significant weight. "If you're serious about that, there's a lot of work to be done," she said. He nodded. "I know, and I'm ready to start." In the following months, Barrett kept his word. He began giving lectures on unconscious bias in courtrooms and universities, sharing his experience as a judge who, for years, handed out disproportionately harsh sentences without realizing the real impact of his decisions. To many, it seemed like a public attempt at redemption, but Sarah knew that regardless of his intentions, the message was reaching places where no one had dared to question the system before. Barrett's name, once associated with injustice, was now beginning to appear in debates about judicial reform. The irony of fate, Sarah thought, as she saw an article highlighting his new stance. But the most surprising event occurred when he sought Sarah out again. "I want to help structure mandatory training for judges on racial bias and institutional discrimination," he said during one of their regular meetings. Sarah crossed her arms. "Do you really think judges, especially the most experienced ones, will want to listen to you?" Barrett smiled humorlessly. "Maybe not, but they can't ignore me. I am living proof that the problem exists." Sarah pondered for a moment. He was right. If a judge as respected and problematic as Barrett could admit his mistakes, perhaps there was hope for real change. Barrett's transformation into a proponent of judicial reform generated mixed reactions. Some saw him as a hypocrite trying to clean up his reputation, while others believed that his change in attitude was a sign of progress. Sarah, however, wasn't concerned with public opinion about him. What really mattered was the impact it could have on the system. She had seen firsthand how biased judicial decisions destroyed lives. They weren't just tickets or sentences. They were denied opportunities, families torn apart, and careers ruined before they even began. If Barrett could use his influence to stop that from happening, then so be it. The first major test came when a group of veteran magistrates opposed the training on unconscious bias. "This is an insult to our experience," shouted one judge during a meeting that Sarah attended. "We have been applying the law impartially for decades. Suggesting that we don't know what we're doing is a disrespect." Barrett, who was now on the opposite side of the room, didn't hesitate to respond. "I'm not saying that you don't know how to apply the law. I'm saying that often you don't realize how unevenly you apply it." The ensuing silence was tense. Sarah watched intently, Years ago, Barrett would have echoed exactly what that judge had said. But now, he understood the problem from the inside out, and more than that, he was willing to confront it. The debate continued heatedly, but the mere fact that such a conversation was taking place was already a step forward. For Sarah, it was a reminder that structural change didn't happen overnight. It required persistence, concrete data, and above all, people willing to challenge a system that benefited from inertia. And it was at that moment that she realized her fight was far from over. Barrett was just one example of something much larger. How many other judges were making the same mistakes, never being questioned? How many people were still being punished disproportionately with no one to defend them? The Barrett case had been closed, but Sarah's work was only just beginning. Sarah soon realized that the battle against judicial bias was much broader than she had imagined. Every week, new cases reached her desk, people sharing experiences similar to those she had witnessed in Barrett's courtroom. Some stories were even worse, men and women convicted on flimsy evidence, young lives ruined before they even had a chance to start over. The pattern repeated in various regions of the country. Black and Latino defendants received disproportionate sentences compared to white defendants who committed the same offenses. And the most alarming part, the majority of these sentences were never questioned. That's when Sarah began to expand her efforts. In addition to monitoring the implementation of the judges' training programs, she became directly involved in creating a national database to track disparities in judicial decisions. The idea was simple, yet powerful. Any lawyer, researcher, or citizen could access trial records and identify patterns of discrimination based on real statistics. The more transparent the system became, the harder it would be for unjust judges to hide behind bureaucracy. But, as expected, resistance came quickly. Some courts refused to release their data, claiming the information could be misinterpreted. Others argued that each case was unique and that numbers could not determine whether a sentence was discriminatory or not. Sarah, however, knew that their greatest fear wasn't misinterpretation, it was the truth being revealed. She also understood that this battle would not be won solely within the courts. Public education was essential. So she began giving lectures, attending conferences, and granting interviews to ensure that people understood their rights and knew how to recognize when they were victims of an unjust decision. Many had grown up believing that one could not question a judge, that any decision was final and unquestionable, but Sarah wanted to change that mindset. If she could empower more citizens to know how to denounce abuses, the system would finally begin to be held accountable from within. As her influence grew, Sarah started to realize something she had never really considered before. This struggle wasn't just about taking down one corrupt judge or exposing individual injustices. It was about changing the culture of the entire judicial system. And culture wasn't changed only by laws or policies. It changed with awareness, education, and persistence. When Barrett was exposed, many people saw the case as an isolated event. But now, after months of debates, investigations, and concrete data, it was clear that he was just a symptom of a much larger problem. The difference now was that the problem could no longer be ignored. Sarah's initiatives began to have a real impact. More courts started adopting mandatory training on unconscious bias, and legal organizations pushed for greater transparency in the system. The database she helped create was already being used by defense attorneys to contest suspicious decisions, and some judges began to change their approach, aware that their sentences were under scrutiny. But Sarah knew this was a battle without an end. There would always be resistance. There would always be those who tried to keep things as they were. But that didn't demotivate her. On the contrary, knowing that her work was generating real change was enough to keep her going. One cold evening, while reviewing a report on the early impacts of the reforms, Sarah received an unexpected message. It was from Marcus, the man she had met in the courtroom on the day everything began. "I wanted to thank you, not only for what you did with Barrett, but for showing that it's worth fighting. For the first time, I feel we have a chance to be heard." Sarah smiled. She had begun this journey trying to correct a personal injustice, but in the end, she ended up paving the way for something much larger. She didn't know where this fight would take her in the coming years, but she knew one thing: she would never again remain silent in the face of injustice.